Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing fine. So this experimental format we tried over the holidays where...
the thing we were calling the diavlog.
Right, the diavlog did not seem to strike a resonant chord with our viewers. They want to see our riveting repartee.
Well, I think the way they put it is if forced to choose between the two.
No, I think that they like your truculence and yet with the undercurrent of affection. I mean, they get the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I do maintain that format has potential for certain kinds of uses, and that it was not put to one of those uses in its initial run around the track.
I agree with that.
The other development is etymological. We were using diavlog to refer exclusively to that format, and then we discovered via a little email that shortly before we debuted that format, somebody had used the term diavlog to update our entries in Wikipedia to refer to the kind of thing viewers are looking at now. And moreover, today, I think, in the Boston Globe, a piece by Alex Beam mentioned our site, which we're grateful for, and used the term diavlog apparently in a broadly generic way. So maybe what you're looking at now is a diavlog, and maybe we invented the form or something.
Let's call them all diavlogs.
Let's call them all diavlogs.
When legend becomes fact, print the legend. Let's go with it.
Exactly. Now, Mickey, you know who I'd hate to be right now? I'd hate to be somebody who had confidently predicted the commercial inertia of Brokeback Mountain.
Well, you trapped me into making this estimate that it wouldn't top 50 million, which turned out to be foolish and rash.
Oh, I think you've still got a shot at making that. I think the truth is I let you set the ceiling too high. I mean, we're talking about a love story that is not a comedy. It's not a romantic comedy. How many of those top 25 million? Can you think of any offhand?
Sure, The English Patients. Big love story, 70, 80 million.
Really?
Yeah.
So that's one for the last
It did win
decade.
the Academy Award, but Brokeback might win the Academy Award.
Well, there you go. Anyway, the reason is, I'm looking at Box Office Mojo's weekend. At this point, it's still an estimate, but you've got Brokeback Mountain it's coming in at number 14, but if you look at the per theater gross, it is way ahead of everything else in the top 20. 13,000 per theater. Brought in, supposedly, according to this estimate,
that's over a whole weekend.
Million. What's that?
That's over a whole weekend. That's not every night.
No, but the point is, it's
well, it's doing very well.
The point is, it's way ahead of everything else in the top 20. It's still in a small number of theaters, but they're going to expand that, and that is auspicious. The other thing is, I went to MoviePhone.com both yesterday and today, and the most requested movie on both days is. Brace yourself for this. Is Brokeback Mountain.
First, the fact that it plays well in a few selected suburbs doesn't mean it's going to break out into the red states. But I think I'm pretty much going to be wrong on the 50 million estimate. It had a very good weekend last weekend. It did much better last weekend than the weekend before, and I would have predicted it would be petering out by now. So,
well, it still has only grossed about 14 million, but
people who know more than I say that I might have had a shot if it wasn't going to win any awards, but it's going to win some awards, and that's going to put it over 50 million.
Well, the other thing I think you didn't count on is there's a reason they call liberal elites elites. They actually have influence. If you put the thing on the cover of Entertainment Week. And do things like that, it's going to have an impact. The other thing is, this was the week last week in which all the reviewers named their top 10 or 20 favorite movies of the year. Now, how many reviewers do you know who are going to keep that thing off their list?
No, right, but and it seems to be a good movie. But my fallback position, once I lose the 50 million bet, is that Frank Rich said it was going to break out into the red states. It's going to be a mainstream phenomenon, and I claim that even though it does a lot of business, it is not going to be a mainstream phenomenon.
You're treading water at best.
You're not going to. You're not going to find people in the red states embracing this movie and having it change their viewpoint.
We will see. Well, final point is, there is this theory about the civilizing process by, I think, a sociologist named Norbert Elias, and he argued that basically, if you look at things like views on things like slavery and the death penalty and so on, move to a position that now many people would refer to as civilized. it is elites that lead the way. It's a trickle-down process, and so you may have seen some of that in action on this front. I imagine if you looked at slavery 150 years ago, you'd find it was Eastern elites who were being very influential.
That might happen, and the movie might have that impact even if people don't go to see it, because they accept it as a cultural fact that it exists.
That's true.
But that wasn't my prediction was not that the movie wouldn't have an impact, but that's a very good point.
Well, you're being very graceful in accepting ignominious defeat, Mickey.
I figure it's better to be graceful now than the amount of gracefulness it'll take will increase over time as it gets clearer and clearer that I was wrong.
Yeah.
So bury your mistakes early.
You're a master at that, buddy.
Okay, I know. Okay, I'm going to ring the bell. Oh, that was a...
Was that a bell?
That was a pathetic bell. Here we go. Here's a better one.
Ah, yes, the resonant sound of a topic ending. What's the next topic?
Iraq.
Well, supposedly the news is good.
The news does seem to be good. It's clear that the brouhaha over the mistakes and chicanery involving the elections is fading. Either it was exaggerated or it's being swept under the carpet in the interests of national unity. And it's also clear that the government looks like it's going to be formed by the Kurds and the Shiites with the possible cooperation of one of the two Sunni parties. Now, you speculated, you asked last week, was there a fundamentalist Sunni party? It turns out there is, but that's the more reasonable party, the Islamic Sunni party.
Well, that's the party that seems to be in on the deal, if there is one.
Right. The other party are radical Baathists, so they're...
And they seem to be left out in the cold. I mean, the story's saying that there are signs of a three-way deal with the Shiite religious parties, the Kurds, and the Sunnis say it is the Sunni religious parties.
Right. Right. And the problem is that they don't, that some parts of the Shiites and maybe the Sunni religious parties don't want to have anything to do with Alawi. So that's a bone of contention. And the other, of course, bone of contention is federalism. Yeah.
Well, apparently al-Sadr doesn't want anything to do with Alawi.
Right.
And he commands the Mahdi army. Right. I mean, I think it actually would have been much more convenient for American readers if it so happened that al-Sadr commanded the Badr Brigade, but no, the Badr Brigade is different.
But the interesting thing is that Juan Cole pointed out this irony, that the people who are for holding Iraq together are Sadr, who was our big enemy for a while, and Sistani, who allegedly is the new Ayatollah, yet who seems to be a voice for reason in all this. So the people that are going to stop Iraq from falling apart are those two guys.
I would not count Sadr in on that deal. I mean, he's been consistently a wild card.
He's apparently taken a straightforward anti-federalist position. Anti-devolution.
That's right. But apparently the Kurds, according to the New York Times, are still kind of holding, that's an unresolved issue. They're still holding out for them having kind of special status.
Well, but the Sunnis agreed to let them have special status. They just don't want anybody else to have that status.
Yeah, but it seems to me that depends very much on how the oil gets worked out between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and I don't know why they would feel assured.
Right. The most disturbing thing I read was a Simon Jenkins piece in the Times of London. His basic point is that the occupation has failed. We are not contributing to the security. The security is sort of arranged informally by these local militias, and he makes the argument that we are only hurting things by creating more terrorists with our sweeps. I don't know if that's true or not. It was disturbing. On the other hand, even his worst case doesn't seem that bad, and doesn't seem that far from Bush's best case. The range of possible options seems to be narrowing into a fairly acceptable range. I mean, he says if we leave, they're going to cut some sort of deal. They're going to suppress the more radical elements, either pro-Iranian or Zarqawi, and it'll be sort of a sort of mobocracy at worst. And isn't that better than what was there before?
Well, two things. First of all, judging by this recent American initiative, where we're going to be monitoring more closely, supposedly, the militias, the largely Shiite and to some extent Kurdish forces that man the security apparatus, by and large, our presence does make a difference in that scenario. That we may be the main thing that's keeping them from being so belligerent that it will devolve into a civil war. The other thing is, I'm not quite so saying. I mean, as long as the Baathists are left out in the cold, which is the current scenario as of today, I'm not quite so sanguine about things pacifying really rapidly.
Well, you mean because the Baathists will be left out in the cold and they'll still resort to violence?
They've been known to embrace violence, yes.
It's weird. The leader of the Islamic Party, according to Iraq the Model, promised that when he's included in the coalition, you will see the violence subside. And Iraq the Model took this as a positive sign because it's not like his threat previously to increase violence if he's left out of the coalition.
Wait, that was a Baathist who said that?
No, this was the leader of the Sunni Islamic Party, the people that are in the government.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, it's exactly the same thing as the threat. It's the same threat.
I know. That thought occurred to me as well. He was not changing his position.
But it is, he is sort of insinuating that he can deliver at least a reduction in violence if he's included. And isn't there a penalty to making idle, boastful threats? Promises you can't keep.
Yeah, I mean, he must have some influence, but it gets back to the problem that we've never had a clear idea of what the composition of the insurgency was, and often it was depicted as kind of Baathists on the one hand, and then these foreign jihadists. Well, if this guy has much influence, then there was a third large fraction.
No, it could just be that he'll get his neighbors to turn in the Baathists and the foreign jihadists, and right now that they're adopting a neutral stance.
No, well, okay, but that'll be a slow process.
And the other thing is that people seem to have acknowledged that Kirkuk has been sort of ceded to the Kurds in some sort of deal.
Yeah, and that's kind of curious in a way to me that the Sunnis would sign on to that so readily, although maybe the victims of that, many of whom are Turkmen,
right,
are not allied with the mainstream Sunnis or something.
It's not clear that the Sunnis have signed off on that part of the deal.
I don't think they have a deal until they do. That's a pretty contentious part of everything.
Right. For the moment, though, things are looking better than they were a week and a half ago.
True.
And I still think Sistani should have been Man of the Year. I mean, where would we be if he was a different kind of guy?
Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
You think he's more important than Bono?
But certainly not more important than Bill Gates.
No.
Or Melinda Gates.
No, certainly he has not influenced my life as profoundly as Bill Gates, and whether that's for better or worse, I won't say right now.
Okay.
What next?
Wiretaps? 2 serious ones in a row? Why not?
Yeah, let's keep the gravitas high. That's what they like about it.
Okay. My take on it, there's a very good article by Charles Fried which raised what seems to me the interesting issue, which is there any constitutional scheme that can do what we want? I mean, it was clear from the Newsweek article that what we're doing is we're taking all these phone calls, basically every international phone call, and running them through these computers, and if people use trigger words like, terrorist or bomb or Brooklyn Bridge.
Every phone call?
I think it's every international phone call.
We have enough computing power to do that, and it involves voice recognition?
Sure, we did that in Europe for years. It's called the Echelon system. We have huge computers in Scotland, and they just run everything through them.
Everything?
Everything, including faxes, as I understand it. And emails. They're really big computers.
They must be. It's one thing to do email, but voice recognition, I would think, eats up a lot more computer power. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I could be wrong, but that's the impression the Newsweek article gives. And obviously we don't have probable cause, which is a requirement that's written in the Fourth Amendment, to search these phone calls of everybody. So if they are searches under the Fourth Amendment, then there's no way constitutionally to do them, yet we want to do them. That seems to me is the core dilemma, and you can say, well, they're constitutional because they involve, borders and foreign powers and the president's national security power, and that's an implicit exception to the Fourth Amendment. That's fine, but what happens when they're domestic terrorists and we want to do it to all domestic phone calls? Then we're in deep trouble.
Well, this would explain why the Bush administration didn't want to take this to Congress, because in your view, it didn't take mere legislation to authorize this. It took a constitutional amendment.
Or free calls for ingenuity, and I interpreted that as ingenuity in terms of defining this not as a search or figuring out some other loophole that will get around the Constitution.
Or the kind of judicial interpretation that normally conservatives hate, which is to say creative.
Right.
But I would say this is all the more reason that that as far as the interests of the Republic are concerned, the Bush administration should have brought this to the attention of Congress and the public. And you know, I think there's kind of some confusion on what the issue is here. I mean, the Bush administration is saying, we need this kind of thing to fight the war on terror. Well, fine, but that's not the only issue. There's also the issue of whether you should have cleared it with somebody other than Laura, okay? This involves fundamentally new issues of civil liberties and so on. By your account, it involves violating the Constitution itself. There's just absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is something we should have discussed. And that's Bush's main culpability. It doesn't have to do with whether this is or is not essential. That's something we can hash out and figure out. And I haven't heard a good reason that he could not.
Well, the good reason is I mean, first, it's a constitutional gray area because it involves foreign powers.
What? So we shouldn't talk about constitutional gray areas?
We shouldn't talk about it because because there was sort of an emergency, and in the course of talking about it, he would reveal that we're running every phone call through the Echelon computers, and the terrorists didn't know that. Why tell them? At least why tell them for the first 4 years after 9/11? Then we can have the debate at our leisure when we've rounded up as many of them as we can. But right now, we want for the initial few years, we want the element of surprise. It seems to me, if you look at through a non-legal context, that's a perfectly reasonable way for the country to proceed to solve this problem.
I think these guys are enough in awe of our technology that they always speak in code. Email, voice, whatever.
They caught one guy who said the words Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, and you know what I read today is that that so-called plot to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge was this kind of Keystone Cops type thing that involved taking it apart with blowtorches or something. I mean, really, you know, I don't believe much of anything coming out of this administration personally.
But it does seem to me that the way to go is to figure out what we want to do and then figure out how to do it. We want to be able...
and how do you figure things out, Mickey? I guess you'd have to almost talk about them, wouldn't you? You'd have to have a president who didn't keep them a secret.
We're talking about them now.
Yeah, thanks to him not getting his way.
Thanks to a leaker, yes.
Who they're now trying to hunt down and prosecute.
Right, that's true. It seems to me that Jim Pickerton's essay, which was very Bob Wrightian...
except for the part about how the solution is to colonize other planets.
Right, he says weapons are getting so much deadlier and smaller that we're going to have greater and greater invasions of privacy in order to ferret them out. And the only solution to this dilemma is to colonize outer space where we can go without fear of these weapons. Except for the last part, it was very Bob Wrightian.
Well, the point about how, there is this what I call it is the growing lethality of hatred, because more and more smaller and smaller groups of extremely hateful people will have the capacity to kill large numbers of people in the absence, first of all, in the absence of effective arms control and various other things that I don't think the Bush administration is pursuing effectively. But secondly, Mickey, notice the key, the lethality of hatred. In other words, there is this third variable, aside from security and liberty. There is the amount of antipathy in the world. The less of that there is, the less civil liberties you have to sacrifice in order to maintain security. And that's what the Bush administration is completely
I agree with that. But
ignored.
If you agree that we have to sacrifice some civil liberties in order to prevent the greater lethality of weaponry, this seems to me like the first step you take. This is a minimal intrusion into privacy. Running your phone call through some anonymous computer without even a guy there, and if you use a trigger word, it pops out, and then they get some sort of more authorization. Figuring out some way to keep that under control, some judicial supervision, and that's as minimal an invasion of privacy to meet this threat as you can think of.
Actually, I'm not conceding that in all cases we're going to have to give up more civil liberties to maintain our security. It depends on how much hatred there is in the world. So far, the Bush administration is doing a good job of keeping the level of anti-Americanism high enough so that we would have to sacrifice civil liberties to maintain our security. But that's not an intrinsic feature of the modern world.
But even the amount of hatred there was at the end of the Clinton administration that produced 9/11 is
enough. It
enough.
may be that we have to positively decrease the amount of hatred that existed at that point in order to maintain our civil liberties. That is possible.
But
that's why this.
So you think there is some hope of decreasing the level of hatred so much that we won't have to sacrifice any of our civil liberties?
Oh, sure. In the long run, because I think a lot of the anti-American hatred was not necessary.
But after anti-American hatred, it's going to be pro-animal hatred. It's going to be defense of the trees. I mean, they're voiceless. The animals are voiceless.
I made these very points in my book, so this isn't new to me.
Right. Well, so how are you going to stop them without invading privacy?
Well, again, those levels of hatred are not assured either. I mean, they're not. Those aren't very high right now. That's not a very lethal form of hatred right now.
The Earth Liberation Front isn't that far from
when you look at the incredible number of missteps going back decades that have led the United States to be so resented, I mean, we just don't have to keep repeating these mistakes. We could, in principle, have a more enlightened president. Now, in a way, I'm not that optimistic because there's a lot of political incentives that lead presidents to do the kind of things that get us hated. So it would take extraordinarily enlightened leadership. It would. I'm just saying it's not a given that we're going to have to give up more and more civil liberties. And I'm certainly not convinced that what the Bush administration did in this case was essential. But then again, we don't know what they did because they won't tell us. So it's hard to say.
So you're not going to hitch a ride on Jim Pickett's spaceship just yet?
At the right price, I would. But that is, the one thing about that scenario is I think it at most is going to help a small fraction.
Well, the price is coming down thanks to Richard Branson. But I got to ring the bell.
Okay. What else?
Bob Herbert wrote a good column about
against gangsta rap.
Against gangsta culture, not just gangsta rap. He didn't even blame the Bush administration's failed economic policies and heartlessness. He said it's a sickness within the black community that needs to be rooted out.
Right.
I give him points for that. He sort of implies that this gangsta culture, which leads to so much violence and makes male self-esteem dependent on thinking yourself as a playa and a pimp, that it comes from nothing. And it doesn't come from nothing. It comes. I'm enough of a Marxist to think it comes from some way of life, and the way of life is drug dealing, and also the broken black family. It leads me to think maybe the answer is some sort of legalization of drugs. And that's one implication of that.
Well, certainly I would say it's dependent on establishing alternative avenues to social status for young blacks in the inner city. And what you've just described is one way to close off the present avenue, I guess, if there's no money in drug dealing.
Right.
I mean, what I didn't like about the column was he said what we need is for more black leaders to speak out about this. It reminds me of people who say, well, what we need to do to get rid of radical Islam is for more officials in Muslim nations to speak out about, against it. And so, I mean, these are just not the people who have street cred among the crowd we're talking about to begin with, right? The gangster rappers are not big followers of Jesse Jackson, I think.
Well,
so
you heard that you've been hearing for years that gangster rap is dead, and that the next generation of rap producers, who are the real people with street cred, not Jesse Jackson, but the guys producing the next generation of rap music, we're turning against gangster rap, and we're producing a more wholesome variety of rap, and that doesn't seem to have happened. One theory is that whites have now taken up gangster rap, and so there's so much money in it now that corporate interests have an interest in maintaining people like Snoop Doggy Dogg when otherwise their shelf life they would have expired naturally.
Yeah.
The other possibility is you can't beat something with nothing. I mean, rap. I keep waiting for rap music to be supplanted by a better form of music, and I thought I'd heard it a couple of years ago, and it doesn't seem to have materialized. It's a little inexplicable to me, actually.
yeah.
It's only instead of dying, it's totally pervaded mainstream culture. I mean, you have Snoop Dogg on national advertisement with Lee Iacocca. He's now a respectable guy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the players well enough to know whose lyrics are really pernicious and whose aren't. I mean, I know there is I assume a whole dimension of rappers who are doing reasonably innocuous lyrics, right?
Yeah.
And they're the ones that suburban parents try to get their kids to listen to or something. But
well, I don't think the suburban parents know the difference, but they, but all my suburban
they're
parents...
the ones who do halftime at the Super Bowl, though, right?
Sorry?
They're the ones who would do halftime at the Super Bowl,
well,
presumably.
I don't think Nelly did halftime at the Super Bowl, and he grabbed his crotch and did very offensive things, and the lyrics to his...
That's becoming a Super Bowl tradition.
Yeah. Well, it was long before, I think. But his songs are fantastic, and the lyrics are wildly offensive. So I think they've already permeated halftime at the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And,
well, like you, I'm enough of a Marxist to think you got to change the means of production.
yeah, well, I thought welfare reform did that, and if it's not enough, then we have to think of something else, like changing the drug culture. Okay.
So now, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Mickey.
Yeah.
Now, several years ago, she exited the stage in disgrace, having been nailed for plagiarism. In one book in particular, there were dozens and dozens of examples of kind of taking, these appropriating a single sentence, maybe changing a word or so on.
Disgrace.
What's that?
Not enough disgrace.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, now, you just turn on the TV a week ago and see her warmly welcomed onto, on a talk show. She's, getting very respectful reviews for her book on Lincoln. It makes the New York Times list of best 100 books of the year. It makes the bestseller list. Virtually no one in all of this even alludes to the scandal. I did a Google News search of her name and Lincoln and got over 100 hits. I did one of her name and Lincoln and plagiarism and got 2 hits. And the question arises... shouldn't we make her continue to suffer?
Well,
to put it crudely.
It detracts from her credibility. I mean, there was an article by Ron Brownstein saying that her book showed that President Bush is more like Polk. He's divisive, and he should be more like Lincoln, non-divisive. Although arguing that Lincoln is non-divisive, it seems like a heavy lift. But, do we trust her in her analysis of what Polk was like and what Lincoln was like? That depends on her honesty, and until she fesses up to the full extent of her plagiarism, I don't see why we should trust her.
Well, again, I guess I'm enough of a Marxist to think that the world of letters and scholarship and everything is to some extent superstructure, and so, in other words, there are underlying material factors and economic factors, and so on that bias a lot of people's presentations of a lot of things. In other words, I treat all of this stuff with some suspicion.
But what is the underlying economic factor here? That your books make a lot of money?
No. I just mean ultimately, you let me retract everything I just said. I mean, it would take too long to explain it. But my point is, I'm cynical enough to assume that everyone carries some kind of bias into what they write. Or maybe I'm enough of a postmodernist or something, although I'm not much of one of those. And I'm not sure there's much of a connection between being dishonest in the sense of plagiarism and being dishonest in the sense you're talking about. I mean, I guess I think most historians go into their study with in some sense, an agenda, whether it's dramatic or not. I mean, the thing I'm wondering about is just whatever happened to stigma. I mean, if we really want to discourage things like plagiarism, and not just among well-known writers, but among like students and so on, should we not punish it more severely? I mean, stigma is just not what it used to be.
Well, it's weird. I mean, certainly plagiarism in Britain is not considered nearly as big a sin as it is in the United States.
No, and neither is plain old inaccuracy. I mean,
right. And but I agree it is a sin and it's a form of falsity. And I agree that she has skated away. She mounted a very high-powered defense. She hired a lawyer. She
enlisted Bob Shrum apparently as an informal advisor. So this would be his one success story.
And she had a very good lawyer in D.C. named Michael Nussbaum who actually helped me out at one point. And they tried to erect a wall protecting her big, saying, "Oh, it was just these few books." And then the LA Times sort of blew that out of the water by showing that this was her modus operandi in basically all her books.
Is that right?
Yeah, and nobody paid attention to the LA Times. It was like...
Now, you got to link to that.
I blogged about it when it happened, but I will link to it.
Well, also, I mean, I should say she did pay a little bit of a price. That although she resisted stepping down from the Pulitzer Prize committee, amazingly, in my view, they finally booted her. And also, much to his credit, Jim Lehrer, I assume it was his call at the PBS NewsHour, dropped her. She had been a very regular commentator, and I think she's still dropped. And that's got to be hard. I'm sure they were friends, at least, socially.
I didn't realize that had happened. Yes,
that did happen, and I think it still stands.
I bet you.
And I'm quite impressed. Now, I got to say, having said all this, I'm a little suspicious of my own thirst for retribution in this case, because I'm sure some of it comes from the reptilian core of my brain. She's got a Pulitzer Prize and a bestseller, two things I don't have, and also I should say I think. Every writer who's written much has perpetrated a dishonesty in some sense or another at some point. Either depicting someone as more demonic than they are because it fits into your storyline, and that storyline will get your story onto the front page, or whatever. I mean, we've all had our lapses.
All people are asking is that she fess up to the full extent of it and say she won't do it again.
Well, yeah, that might...
And she hasn't done that. Instead, she mounted this legalistic defense, which the LA Times destroyed.
And I also feel, the slot she occupies, which is somebody who's automatically taken seriously, book gets reviewed everywhere, she gets on any show she wants, that's very kind of rare cultural shelf space. There are a lot of hardworking, honest, reliable historians out there who, are just as worthy, but we know that all kinds of arbitrary facts can go into determining who gets this shelf space and who doesn't. And in light of the amount of randomness that goes into that in the first place, I think if you misstep this egregiously, maybe we should give your shelf space to somebody else. But again, I'm not arguing for laws or anything. I'm talking about the realm of informal sanction, the realm of stigma, which is what keeps moral systems robust enough that you don't have to have laws policing these kinds of things.
I agree.
But again, so much of that was coming out of the reptilian core of my mind that we should dismiss it.
We want the reptilian core. That's the whole point of
Is that good for ratings?
Of our interaction is to bring out your reptilian core.
You do your best. You do your best, and you're good at it.
We want all it.
All the time.
So, yeah. Okay.
We emote, you decide.
What was that last bit?
We emote, you decide.
Yes, like Anderson.
Just hit me out of the blue, spontaneously. That's the kind of creativity that happens.
Yeah, like on camera too, on live TV.
Remarkable.
It's like Anderson Cooper.
A lot like that, except for the salary and several other things.
Yeah, good. Let's stop there.
Okay.
Before we libel any more people.
Okay.
Okay.
Merry New Year.
See ya. Same to you.
See ya.